but that's funny. Small world.
Yeah.
I've never met another girl named Lakin, so I guess I'll have to meet her.
That's why when you said your name, I was like, no, I can't be right. And then
Yeah, there's few and far between of us.
Okay. So remember that the Canvas site is something that you should visit weekly because there's lots of information. And remember that the way to see the information, and I set it up all ahead of time this time instead of adding things during the quarter, I was a little bit more organized, is to go to the home page. So the home page is just, looks like this. And so at the very top you have the syllabus, a copy of the syllabus, which is what I just gave you, and then a copy of the tentative schedule, and then access codes for my lab. And it might be that you don't need access codes, but it may be that you do. So I haven't quite figured that out. So if you could check on that sometime before Wednesday, I would greatly appreciate it. So instead of going to the assignments is a place that you can actually see all of the assignments, but it's probably best to visit from the home because there will also be information like maybe some homeworks additional to this, and also the lectures I'm going to record and try to post during each week. So you notice that week 1, the first assignment is chapter 20, and that's the lymphatic system. And so this is going to now be due Sunday at midnight. So that's kind of the default, I know, for most instructors. And so instead of making it due Monday or Thursday, it's going to be Sunday. And you'll notice here that actually you won't be able to see these lectures because they're hidden from you. So this is my view. Actually, I can go to student view here. Okay, there. This is more what yours will look like. Okay, so you'll also notice that there should be more weeks. Oh, maybe I need to publish them. So it's always good to look at the student view. Okay, so you notice that there are some PhysioX. And so listed in your syllabus are the required PhysioXs, and then there are 2 extra credit PhysioX. So you can do those, but they are due at a specific date, and I believe that is December 3rd. So they're due at the very end. So for example, I put these extra, so it should be here. So I put these extra credits here, the digestion PhysioX and the immune system PhysioX, and those make up about the same amount of points as 1 lab. So specifically, if you miss a lab and there's no way to make it back up, you can do these extra credits to make those points back up, okay? So looking at the syllabus, you'll notice that if you look at the tentative syllabus, the tentative schedule on the very last page, you'll notice that we have a midterm exam and a final exam. And then we have only 1 lab practical. So rather than multiple lab practicals, we're just having 1 big lab practical at the very end, because there's not as much stuff in this lab as they were in the previous lab. So when we did the skeletal systems and we did the muscles, right? And so this is more physiology, but of course we'll learn the parts of the respiratory system and the digestive system, but it's a little bit less memorization of anatomy and a little bit more physiology, okay? So along with these exams, remember that we have weekly in-class quizzes. So the first quiz will be on next Monday, and it will be over only the information that we have covered in the lecture today and Wednesday. And then our lab this week is lymphatic/immunity, and so that is going to be on Friday at 10 o'clock. And that is downstairs in ST 119, okay? For the lab, remember that you should have a separate notebook, and it is always best, I think it works best for these labs if it's 3-ring binder, so that you can put the lab handouts in there and you can write on the lab handouts, and then at the end of the quarter, you'll have a whole portfolio of everything that you have completed in lab this quarter, okay? Are there any questions about those? So you have the online homework, online quizzes. We also have in-class quizzes, 1 lab practical, the midterm, and the final exam. And then the weekly labs are also worth points. Okay, so let's start with the lymphatic system. And I forgot to check if this pen actually works. It does, yay, okay. So this is chapter 20 in your textbook. And the lymphatic system is interesting because it is often not a common system that you learn about if you were just taking a regular biology class. But it is really important, and specifically when it goes wrong, it causes a lot of problems, right? So what is the lymph? Does anybody know what is this? I'll give you an idea. It is fluid, but where does the fluid, where does the lymph come from? That the lymphatic system then has to transport. It's in the blood, so it's not blood cells, not necessarily, but it's from the capillaries, right? So we have fluid lost from capillaries. So you remember that capillaries are actually part of the circulatory system, and that is where we have exchange between the blood and the interstitial fluid. So interstitial means inside the tissues. So this is the fluid that surrounds all of your cells. And remember that the capillaries are leaky. So if I was to kind of draw a picture of my capillary, right? And we have the arterial end at this side. And we have the venule end at this side. So this is a little review, but it's important to understand that lymphatic system. So this is my capillary. So blood comes into the capillary under relatively high pressure at the arterial end. So it flows, blood flows in this direction. In this direction. Right? But because the capillaries are leaky, oftentimes because of that high pressure, water and proteins and other solutes actually leave the capillaries. So then you get, for example, water leaving, right? We also get oxygen leaving. We also get ions, so like sodium and chloride ions and calcium ions leave. And then we get small molecules, so small organic molecules like small proteins. Right? So that's all at the arterial end. So notice how I have the arrows pointing out, because this out here is called the interstitial fluid. So big proteins actually get stuck inside of the capillary. So if I put in here, I'll put large proteins do not leave. And then we also have the blood cells. So the blood cells would include red blood cells. It would include white blood cells, typically don't leave unless there's an infection. And it could also include pieces of cells called platelets, which are involved in blood clotting. Okay. So at the opposite end, at the venule end, instead of water and substances being forced out, actually substances get sucked back in, right? So here we have water coming back in. We have also carbon dioxide being picked back up, right? And then we also have maybe some waste products, right? So waste products like urea. This will be important when we get to the urinary system, right? Because the urea, the waste product from protein digestion, gets picked up by the capillaries and then transported to the kidneys where it's filtered back out, okay? So what is the pressure, or what is the, what causes all of these substances to be sucked back up into the capillaries? It's not hydrostatic pressure, it's not blood pressure. What pressure is it? that sucks things back up. Does anybody remember? What is the diffusion of water? When water moves back in, it's called osmosis, okay? So this is due to osmotic pressure. So osmotic pressure has to do with solute concentrations. So solute concentrations inside the capillary cause water to be picked back up. Right? Osmotic pressure. So it sucks it back up in. Now this sometimes doesn't pick up all the fluid, and then you get fluid buildup in the interstitial fluid. So what you have to then do is you have to have another mechanism by which you can remove the excess fluid that's lost that is not picked back up, okay? Because actually the osmotic pressure might vary a little bit with what you're taking into your body. Like if you're dehydrated or if you're overhydrated, it could affect the osmotic pressure. Okay, and so that is the role of the lymphatic system. So when we look at the lymphatic system, it is always drawn in green. Okay, it is not green in the body, but that's just the color that they give it. Like the nervous system is always yellow. So the lymphatic system is green, and you'll notice here that the lymphatic vessels are surrounding the capillaries in this capillary bed, and then you can see the interstitial fluid that surrounds each and every one of our cells in our body. Okay. Now you'll notice something kind of weird about these lymphatic vessels in that they are blind-ended tubes. And in the past, people actually thought that they were like straws, and they just had a hole in them and they were sucking the fluid out. But now we know that they actually do have a mechanism to open and close, okay? So if we look at this, the lymph, so the lymph would be the excessive or excess fluid, and this could contain cellular debris, right? So if cells die, you know, we have to pick them back up. So it could include cellular debris. It could also include bacteria, viruses, and cancer cells. So if you have cancer cells, sometimes the lymphatic system can pick those up, and that is actually really important because the lymphatic system can then detect the cancer cells and devise a mechanism for destroying them before they become too proliferate. Okay, so we have the lymph. So then we have lymphatic capillaries. So these are blind-ended tubules with a flap. And so what happens when the interstitial fluid increases, it causes the flap to open and fluid enters the lymphatic vessel. And then when there's too much pressure inside the lymphatics, then that flap will close. So in your book, they have a picture of this, and it's this, okay? So it's not like open-ended like a straw. So if the pressure gets too high outside, it is going to force this to open, and that flap is going to open, and then fluid is going to enter in. And then when it gets too high in here, it actually causes that flap to close.
Just like in your heart?
Yes, so it is just like a mechanical valve, and it's opening and closing due to pressure changes, exactly. Okay. So what happens with these lymphatic capillaries is just like the venules in your body, they combine into larger and larger vessels, right? So eventually they're going to take this lymph and they're going to put it back into the circulatory system. Okay. So if we go back here, okay. So we have the lymphatic vessels. Okay. So these are larger and they're vein-like. So remember that the veins are not really capable of pumping the blood. So like the arteries are more elastic and can actually allow the blood to, and it's under high pressure. But the lymphatic vessels they have a little bit of smooth muscle, but there's no pump, right? So I'll put no pump. Okay. So how does this lymph get moved back up towards the heart where it has to re-enter the circulatory system up here by our clavicles? How do you think?
Is it from the pressure?
Well, what happens if you lay around too much? It's under low pressure. Yes. So it's associated with skeletal muscles. So you probably know that if you have a person that's bedridden, they'll start to develop fluid retention in the back of their body, right? So if you move, then the skeletal muscles will actually contract and they'll actually move it back up, right? And then it's kind of interesting because if you do have swelling, and we'll talk about lymphedema in a little bit, but if you do have swelling, you can also apply massage, right? So if you've ever been to a massage therapist, they might have a specific lymphatic massage, and the lymphatic massage is designed to reduce tissue swelling in the body. And so you can massage the lymphatic vessels and move that lymph back up to the heart, okay? So there's no pump, so movement and skeletal muscle. Help to move the lymph. Now, we do have, when we get to, we'll start talking about lymphatic tissue. So let's talk about lymphatic. Actually, let's do this one first. Okay, so this is the diagram that I gave you. Okay. So you'll notice that so these would be the lymph, like maybe they're not showing the lymph out. They're actually not showing the lymphatic capillaries here, so they'd be smaller and smaller. And remember, the lymphatic capillaries extend all through the body. The only place that they're not in is the bones and the teeth, I think, are the only places that the lymphatic tissue does not extend into. So if we look at these, we can see here in the cervical region, we would say that these are our cervical nodes. What is the armpit region called? Axillary. So those are your axillary nodes. And what about the inner region right here? These are the inguinal nodes. So the groin would be the inguinal region. Okay. Now, this didn't actually come out very evident on your handout, but there is a demarcation here. So you might want to just kind of draw a line here coming up through the body, because there's a difference between the right and the left sides of the lymphatic system. Okay, so remember, when you're looking at a diagram, the right side is actually your left because it's anatomical position. So right, this is the right part and this is the left part. Okay, so you'll notice that the right part just drains the head, the neck region, and then the right arm. So all of the lymph that is coming from your legs actually go to the left side of the body. And so this would be where it re-enters. So this is your internal jugular vein. So we learned about these. And then this one, what do you think that one is? It goes underneath the collarbone. So what is that called? Subclavian. Excellent. This is the subclavian vein. Subclavian vein. That's a C. doesn't want to write that well. Subclavian vein, okay? So this is where it re-enters. So this is where it goes back into the circulation. So the lymphatic fluid gets picked up and goes back into the circulation. Now this is kind of interesting. There's this big enlargement right here, which is, you don't need to know that, but it's called the cisterna chyli. And only about half of the people have this larger enlargement here. So not everybody actually has this structure right there. Okay, so when we look at what happens when the lymphatic system gets blocked and the lymph cannot flow, this is called lymphedema. So there's many different types of edema, you know, so you can have congestive heart failure, where your heart is not pumping, and that could cause swelling in your appendages. You could also have an allergic reaction or like anaphylactic shock, which causes extreme swelling and is really dangerous when it's up in the throat region. But lymphedema is specifically associated with blocked lymphatic vessels. So we have blocked lymphatic vessels. So sometimes this is due to damage to that area. And so women that have breast cancer and have their breast tissue removed and the lymph nodes around that breast tissue removed, oftentimes will have lymphedema because they've damaged their lymphatic vessels. And so it's very hard for them to get the lymph to move. So sometimes they have to do a manual lymphatic massage to get it moved, right? So it can be due to damage to vessels, as in a surgery, right? It could actually be a hereditary condition. So some people are born and they have a genetic condition where they don't have enough lymphatic vessels, and so they get swelling in their tissues. So it could be a hereditary problem. And that actually shows up early on. So it doesn't generally, you know, it's in children, you see that really early on. And then it can be also due to obesity. So oftentimes with obesity, you get pressure on the lymphatic vessels, and so it's much harder for the lymphatic vessels to move. And then one interesting example is a parasitic infection. This does not happen in the US, but in places where, like in Asia and Africa, the parasitic infection is a nematode worm. So a nematode is a round worm. And the larvae are transmitted via mosquitoes. So you can get a mosquito bite. The larvae get into your blood, they develop into worms, and then they go into your lymphatic system and they cause cloggage of that lymphatic system. So what is that called? Does anybody know when you have a swelling due to the parasitic infection, there's a name for it? Does anybody know? It is called elephantiasis. You should have said it. Okay, so elephantiasis is caused by a nematode infection. The interesting thing about that is that it's pure. You can treat it if you catch it early on. So you can give a person drugs that will kill the parasite, and then the lymphatic system will recover unless you develop scar tissue. So if the infection gets so bad that scar tissue starts to develop, then it's almost impossible to get rid of the swelling. And it's not like you can amputate it because it's swelling of all the tissues, you know, it's circulatory, the nerves, the blood vessels. So you can't just like cut off pieces of your leg and expect it to be okay. So if we look at some examples of this would be a person that has lymphedema, right, in one of her arms. So sometimes they put compression bandages on this, which actually helps to partially contract the lymphatic vessels to help keep the lymph being moved, right? And then that lymphatic massage can also help. And then this is, for example, would be elephantiasis, which is caused by filarial worms that end up in the lymphatic vessels. Okay. So this is why the lymphatic system is so important, right? Now, it was really interesting because until a few years ago, they thought the lymphatic system was pretty much everywhere in our bodies, except for our bones, which we don't think it's there. But we also thought the lymphatic system didn't have or was not found in the brain until just a couple of years ago. And so they're rewriting the textbooks. So I can't remember if your version of the textbook, it might say that there's no lymphatic vessels in the central nervous system, but that is not true, okay? So this is the lymphatic, these would be the drawing previous, right? So this would be an example of a new drawing, right? And somehow they just missed it because it is associated with those capillaries in the brain. And they actually think it might be important in its role for perhaps causing or being a source of problems for people that have Alzheimer's, because Alzheimer's, you build up amyloid plaques in the brain. So perhaps maybe now that we know about the lymphatic system, we can study it more and actually be able to determine its important function in the brain. So it's kind of interesting that we thought for many, many years there was no lymphatic tissue in the brain, but there is. Okay, so when we look at this lymphoid tissue, it is connective tissue, and specifically it's reticular connective tissue. And reticular, remember, there's reticular fibers in the connective tissue. There's we talked about collagen and elastin, but there's also reticular fibers, and this forms a network. So it's a network, okay, of reticular fibers. And in these reticular fibers, we have lymphocytes. With lymphocytes. Okay. So the lymphocytes are a type of leukocyte. So when we talked about blood, we talked about the neutrophils and the basophils and the eosinophils, for example. The lymphocytes are derived from stem cells in the red bone marrow. So these are derived from stem cells in the red bone marrow. And there's two major classifications of lymphocytes. These include what are referred to as the B cells. And we're going to talk more about this when we get to the immune system, because obviously the lymphatic system, because of the lymph nodes, is really important in the immune system process, okay? And they're called B cells because they mature in the bone marrow, and T cells, which mature in the thymus gland. So the thymus gland sits up in the region of the neck. The thyroid is in the middle, that's metabolic, or has a big metabolic function, but the thymus has an immune function, okay? So these have immune functions. So in your textbook, there's this picture, an electron microscope picture of this reticular connective tissue. Okay. So this just shows the fibers that are in the connective tissue, and then it shows the lymphocytes, which are located right here, and notice the spaces. And so as the lymph comes through, it has to be filtered through these spaces. And so you can imagine that if there's bacteria or viruses or cancer cells, that it would slow down the flow of the lymph. And the lymphocytes could go out and they could, like, for example, the T cells would attack the cancerous cells and destroy them. And then the B cells would see if there's any bacteria or viruses and produce antibodies in response. So we'll talk more about that when we get to the lymphatic system. So there's also macrophages, and we've talked about macrophages a lot because those are they eat stuff, right? So they are phagocytes, and so they eat cellular debris and stuff that comes through this lymphoid tissue. Oops, wait, already talked about it. Okay, so let's look at the organs. So the organs would be composed of many different types of tissues, and these include the lymph nodes. So those cervical nodes, the axillary nodes, the inguinal nodes would all be organs because they actually have a kind of an outer connective tissue and they have an inner connective tissue and maybe even epithelial tissue in there. Okay. We also have the tonsils. So we actually have 3 sets of tonsils. So what are the ones that are in the back of your throat on each side? Does anybody remember what type of tonsil is that? It's not lingual. So lingual is on the back of your tongue. Does anybody remember? What's the bone that makes up the roof of your mouth called? The hard palate, which is called palatine, right? So we have the palatine tonsils. That's the next to, so those are the ones that typically swell up when you get sick, right? Those are the ones that typically get taken out, right? We also have the lingual tonsil. So that's on the back of the tongue. So when you get really sick, the back of your tongue also gets sore. Okay. And then we have the pharyngeal. So those are also called what? Somebody know? They have another name. Adenoids. Excellent. Okay. So the tonsils are really interesting because they actually do not function to filter lymph, but rather they function to capture microorganisms, right? So these specifically don't filter lymph. Oops, filter. The nodes do, right? But the tonsils don't, but they're a different type of organ. So they have crypts that catch microbes. So they are your first line of defense. So it's really important, perhaps, if you're, like if we didn't have modern medical practices, it would be really important to catch the microbes before they get into your lungs, right? So this would actually maybe protect you from more serious lower respiratory infections, right? So it's upper respiratory, which would be like the sinuses in the back of your throat, okay? And so they catch the microbes and then they identify the microbes and then they can custom tailor a adaptive immune response, right? So they can cause an adaptive, which also means specific, immune response. Okay, so let's look at these tonsils. So these are the tonsillar crypts, okay? So debris can sometimes get caught in those tonsillar crypts. Sometimes the tonsils themselves can become infected, and that can be bad. But in general, the tonsillar crypts are designed to capture it and then detect it and identify it and then set out an immune response, okay? But sometimes people have problems with their tonsils that look something like this, okay? And so this is where food and other debris sometimes catches in the tonsils, and these are called tonsil lifts. Tonsil lifts, I think that's how you spell it. Tonsil lifts, maybe tonsil lifts, I can't remember. Anyway, so my daughter had these, so this is where you get debris stuck in there. And so she was constantly coughing them up, and you can press on them and they would pop out, right? But they were also always bleeding, and they were also always infected. And so eventually it just got so bad that her tonsils always looked like this, which causes pain and bleeding and discomfort. So you have them removed, right? So sometimes you have to go in and remove them. So that's a common reason for why people get their tonsils removed is that they have either a chronic infection that their body cannot fight off in the tonsils, or they get stones in the tonsils. Any questions about that idea? Okay. So if we look at this diagram right here, so this is the other diagram that I gave you. This would be the palatine tonsil. This would be my linguinal, and this would be my pharyngeal. There's another diagram on the bottom of that page that also, oh, not this page, but on the bottom of your page that also has the location of the tonsils. So that is upper respiratory. Throat region, throat and pharynx region. So this right here would be what? What do you think that is? I mentioned it. Thymus. Notice how there's two parts to it. So your thyroid would be maybe right in the middle, right? And there's only one thyroid, but there's actually a thymus on each side, okay? So don't confuse it with the thyroid gland, okay? This would obviously be showing the bone, and so this would be the red bone marrow. What do you think this organ right here is? Spleen, excellent. What about this organ here next to the large intestine? Appendix. Okay, and these you probably do not know. These have a specific name. They're associated with your intestines, and they're called Peyer's patches, after the name of the person that discovered them. So some of the lymphatic organs are grouped together as what is called MALT. Okay. So MALT is short for mucus-associated lymphatic tissue. Okay. So like the tonsils, for example, and like the Peyer's patches, right? These are associated with a mucous membrane. And mucus actually captures stuff too, right? So when we produce lots of mucus, it actually captures stuff specifically associated with the lungs. And even in the stomach, the mucus protects the lining of the stomach and the lining of the intestine from bacteria getting into the tissues and then into your circulatory system and causing disease, okay? So that is example of MALT, mucus-associated lymphatic tissue. Okay, you also have another, you have another image. Oops, this is the lymph, oops, I don't have that image. Sorry, I don't have the image that's at the bottom of that page, but you can probably figure out. Okay, okay, so this is an example of a lymph node. And so notice that the lymphatic fluid flows in it in a unidirectional manner. So it comes in, and notice that the lymphatic vessels have valves, and that's what prevents the backflow. So when I said that they're like veins, they have valves. So they come in, and then the lymph node itself has reticular connective tissue in it, and it has lots of pockets of white blood cells, leukocytes and lymphocytes and macrophages and all kinds of blood cells that are going to detect infection. And then it flows out, right? So it can flow out and then back into another vessel before it eventually gets into the circulation up near the neck. Okay, so bubonic plague is an interesting example of a disease where you get infection of the lymph nodes. And so the reason why it's called bubonic plague is it's the swelling of the lymph nodes is called buboes, right? So this is the plague back in the middle centuries of European history that killed off about 1/3 of all Europeans. So about 1/3 of the people died off because of bubonic plague. And so it is due to a bacteria infection. Of the lymph nodes. And so it causes these painful swelling, and it causes the tissue to die. And so that is what is referred to as necrosis. And so what is this also? The bubonic plague was also called what? The Black Plague, right? Because of the tissue dying, right? And you get the Black Death, right? Okay, so antibiotics are very helpful these days in preventing and curing these types of infections. Okay. So we have talked about the spleen previously, and we were talking about blood. And so what does the spleen do for the blood? Does anybody remember? It filters the blood, and it filters it of specifically what? It stores platelets, yes. So platelets are good, so it can store platelets, but what is it destroying? It destroys hemoglobin, which is in red blood cells, right? So this filters blood. Okay. And this is where we have the breakdown of old red blood cells. And remember that these red blood cells contain hemoglobin. And what mineral is in hemoglobin? Iron, right? And so the spleen stores iron. In some animals that dive, and I would imagine in free divers, you know, that can go down and hold their breath and dive down really deep, the spleen also stores extra blood. And so like when you look at diving mammals, they have huge spleens. So if you're thinking about maybe a seal or a whale, they have huge spleens that store oxygenated blood. And then when they dive down, they get the oxygen out of the spleen. Okay, so I would imagine free divers probably have enlarged spleens as well. So those store iron. It also stores platelets. And so platelets are really important if you're hemorrhaging, if you get damage, those platelets can then leave, right, the spleen and go to that site. And so if there's not storage of platelets is important. And remember, platelets are just pieces of white blood cells that are specifically involved in clotting. So this is a diagram of the spleen. Remember that the spleen is only one organ. So where like we have like 2 lungs and we have 2 sides of the heart, we only have 1 spleen. We have 2 kidneys, we only have 1 spleen. And it's kind of associated, it's kind of up near the stomach, but it's in the abdominal cavity, not the thoracic cavity. Oops. We talked about malt. Okay, so Peyer's patches. Okay, these are associated with the small intestine. And so if you think about it, we take in lots of microorganisms with our food, right? And most of those get destroyed in the stomach. The Peyer's patches in the small intestine are associated with the mucosa, and they help to protect the body. So they detect microorganisms in the digestive system. And for some reason, we're getting more and more diseases of the intestine, like gluten intolerance or celiac disease or Crohn's disease. And so this might play an important role in some of those, because sometimes when we'll get to the immune system, sometimes we talk about autoimmune diseases where the immune system actually attacks healthy, normal tissue. And so if that happens into the small intestine, what happens is that you get leaky gut. So if this mucus that isn't there, and if it gets attacked by the immune system or by something else, then the gut gets leaky and stuff can actually move from the intestine and into your tissues and into your blood when you don't want it to, okay? So we'll talk more about this when we get to the immune system and some of the problems with the intestines. Okay, so those are the Peyer's patches. Okay, so lymphoma. What do you think lymphoma is? Cancer. Okay. So I guess it would be a type of leukemia, right, which is white blood cells, but it is lymphoma because it's specifically the lymphocytes that are involved. And there is 2 different kinds, and they're based upon the person that discovered it. So there's Hodgkin's lymphoma. And then there's non-Hodgkin's. And this is kind of an interesting type of cancer because Hodgkin's lymphoma, for example, if you hear about people getting cancer of the blood, of the white blood cells, when they're like 20 or 25 or 30, when they're really quite young, oftentimes it is this lymphoma. And the thing about it is that it has to do with enlargements of the lymph nodes that are not painful. So like say if you get this big enlargement, generally like when you're sick, your lymph nodes feel tender. So that's why the doctors always go like touching your neck, he like wants to feel your neck to see if you have swollen lymph nodes. But if you have like a big swollen lymph node and it's not painful, then that is very serious and you need to go check it out, get it checked out, right? So the reason that they're different is you can actually see the difference underneath the microscope. So Hodgkin's lymphoma has these giant B cells. So specialized B cells become cancerous, and specifically these are called Reed-Sternberg cells. And Hodgkin's lymphoma seems to be associated with a viral infection. So I'll just put that it's often associated with the Epstein-Barr virus. So this is a specific viral infection that you might get, and viruses are known to cause cancer because they insert their genetic material into your genetic material, and so they can cause a disruption of genes that are really important in regulating the cell cycle. And then the non-Hodgkin's is no large cells, but you get cancer of undifferentiated B and T cells. So that's non-Hodgkin's.
Which one's the rare one?
I think Hodgkin's might be more common than the non-Hodgkin's, if I remember correctly. Do I have that written down? I don't. They probably are both bad. The thing about lymphoma is that I've known quite a few people that get it when they're 25. And it's a very good probability of them being cured. because they're young, right? And the immune system is strong, and you can target it. And it seems to be a more readily curable form of cancer than when cancer that happens in older people when their immune systems are so weak. Right? Okay, so there's an image of this. So this just shows a picture of blood cells, right? This is a normal lymphocyte. They have nuclei, and then the Reed-Sternberg cells just become really enlarged, and they develop and they produce more genetic material, but they don't divide. And so you get these super, super large cells called Reed-Sternberg cells. Okay, I think that might be the end there. Okay, so are there any questions? Lymphatic system? There's one other thing I forgot to mention about the lymphatic system. Put your notes away. So we'll also, so just as a note, okay, the lymphatic system, is important in transporting nutrients, specifically fat-soluble nutrients. So when we get to the digestive system, we're going to talk about the lymphatic system some more. Because in our small intestine, when we absorb like cholesterol or other fats, it doesn't get put into the circulatory system right away. You can imagine that that would be very bad. But it gets put into the lymphatic system, where it then kind of gets diluted before it gets passed back up in here. So like if you went and had a Big Mac and French fries and milkshake, the lymphatic system is going to be transporting that fat before it gets put into the circulatory system. So we'll talk about the lymphatic system when we get into the digestive system. Okay, so I will stop there. And we are going to move to chapter 21. And so that is the immune system for Wednesday.